The chandeliers of Rosewood Academy shimmered like frozen constellations, casting cascades of golden light over the marble floor. Every reflection seemed deliberate, every glimmer choreographed, as if even the air itself had been trained to behave with grace. Violins sang softly from the orchestra pit, their delicate notes swirling through the grand hall like silk ribbons. The scent of polished wood, perfume, and anticipation mingled in the air, and the murmur of voices hummed beneath the music low. Elegant buzz of privilege. Children in finely tailored clothes stood in neat clusters near the center of the ballroom. Boys with slicked hair and shiny shoes rehearsed their steps in pairs, while girls, their dresses puffed like pastel clouds, twirled shyly as their mothers watched from the sidelines. Every glance from an adult was sharp and assessing, every smile a subtle performance. This was not just a dance. It was a lesson in inheritance, each curtsy, each bow. A promise that their children would someday carry on the refinement expected of them. Ethan Hale stood at the edge of the floor, small and stiff in his light blue suit. His hair had been combed to perfection, parted neatly by the practiced hand of his family's butler. His shoes gleamed so brightly that he could see his reflection staring back at him, small and frightened. The suit had been chosen by his father himself, custom piece from Milan. Jonathan Hale never settled for anything less than excellence. Not in business, not in family, and certainly not in presentation. Yet the little boy who bore his name could barely move. His hands were cold and slightly trembling as he tugged nervously at the sleeves of his jacket. Around him, laughter floated like crystal chimes, but none of it felt warm. Every giggle, every whisper, seemed to hover just out of reach, close enough for him to hear, but far enough to remind him he didn't belong to it. He watched the other boys, how confidently they took their partners' hands, how they smiled as if the world were already theirs. Their movements were fluid, practiced. They made dancing look effortless, a kind of unspoken language that he could never quite understand. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest as the orchestra shifted to a livelier tune. He tried to mimic a step he had seen during rehearsal, but his foot brushed awkwardly against the polished floor, nearly slipping. No one noticed yet, but he froze anyway, cheeks heating. His tutor had tried to teach him to waltz weeks before the event, but Ethan had stumbled through every lesson, his small body too tense, his rhythm mismatched with the music. The tutor had sighed softly each time, murmuring, "Your father will expect better." Master Ethan. Those words echoed now, louder than the violins, louder than the laughter. He could see his father in his mind, tall, perfectly dressed, his expression carved from marble. Jonathan Hale didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His silence carried weight enough to crush. Ethan had learned early that failure was not just a mistake, it was a reflection of weakness. And weakness in the Hale family was unforgivable. So he stood still, hands clasped behind his back, watching the dance unfold as if from another world. He wanted to be part of it, to laugh, to move without fear, but the invisible wall between him and the others felt unbreakable. His throat tightened, his small chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. A pair of boys near him glanced his way, whispering and grinning. Ethan looked down quickly, pretending not to notice. The orchestra's tempo quickened, filling the air with a bright, carefree melody that seemed to mock him. For everyone else, it was a night of celebration. For him, it was a test. Somewhere across the hall, a woman in a shimmering gown laughed too loudly, and the sound seemed to bounce off the chandeliers like cruel applause. Ethan's fingers curled at his sides. He wanted to disappear into the glittering crowd, to melt into the marble floor. But he stayed, his posture straight, his chin trembling ever so slightly. In that moment, surrounded by elegance and light, Ethan felt something heavy press against his chest. the weight of being a Hale, the heir to a fortune that gave him everything except the freedom to fail. He blinked, his eyes stinging slightly. The world around him sparkled, but inside, all he felt was a quiet ache, the kind that only children who carry adult expectations can understand. And as the orchestra played on, the millionaire's son stood alone in the grandest room in the city, afraid not of falling, but of being seen when he did. Asterisk, the violins sang louder now, their melody sweeping through the grand hall like a command. The dance had begun. Boys and girls moved forward, their shoes clicking softly against the polished floor, faces glowing beneath the chandelier light. The parents leaned closer from their seats, smiles stretched thin and eyes sharp, watching every step as if each child's movement reflected their family's worth. Ethan Hale stood among them still, hesitant and utterly lost. A gentle nudge from one of the teachers broke his trance. "Go on, Ethan," she whispered encouragingly, though her voice carried the faint impatience of someone aware that all eyes were already drifting his way. "It's time to join the others." He swallowed hard. His throat felt dry. His palms were slick against the fabric of his trousers. He could hear his heart pounding louder than the music. One step. That was all it took. He took a breath and walked toward the shining dance floor, every inch of his body trembling with invisible weight. The marble seemed to glow under his feet. He could see his reflection, small and unsure, staring back from the glossy surface. Around him, pairs of children were already moving gracefully, spinning, bowing, laughing. They looked as if they'd been born knowing how to dance. Ethan wasn't. He took another hesitant step. His shoes squeaked faintly. His right foot caught slightly on the floor, and a jolt of panic surged through him. He tried to steady himself, lifting his chin to mimic the composure of the others, but his balance wavered. He stumbled. Not a fall, just enough for the movement to draw attention. A few children nearby noticed. One of the boys, Leonard, the banker's son, taller and smug beyond his years, let out a muffled laugh. "Careful, Hale," he said under his breath. "Wouldn't want to scuff your shiny shoes." Ethan froze. The boy's grin spread, and others around him began to whisper. The laughter grew quiet at first, but sharp, spreading like ripples in a pond. "Look at him. He can't even dance. Guess all that money can't buy rhythm." Each voice felt like a dagger, finding the softest parts of him. Ethan tried to move, tried to show them he wasn't clumsy, but his hands trembled as he lifted his arms. The movement was jerky, forced. He took another step, but his shoes slid against the floor, and this time he nearly tripped. His body lurched forward, catching himself just in time, but the crowd saw it, and they erupted. The sound of laughter filled the grand hall. High-pitched giggles, mocking chuckles, cruel snickers, all blending into a storm that seemed to swallow the music whole. Ethan's chest tightened. His breathing quickened. His face burned hot enough to rival the lights overhead. He could feel every gaze pinned on him, like hundreds of invisible hands pushing him down. His knees trembled. A few of the teachers made weak attempts to hush the laughter, but none succeeded. Even some parents smirked behind their champagne glasses. To them, it was harmless. To Ethan, it was ruin. He wanted to vanish, to disappear into the marble. He thought of his father sitting in his office, tall, uncheckable, untouchable. Jonathan Hale, the name whispered in corridors of power. A man who built empires with nothing but cold precision. And here was his son, a trembling boy who couldn't take a single proper step. Ethan blinked hard, trying to push back the tears gathering in his eyes. "Don't cry." His father's voice echoed in his memory, sharp and commanding. "Never cry where others can see you." He straightened his back. His jaw locked tight. He took another step, forcing his body to obey him. But the floor was slick with polish, and his left shoe caught a loose lace that had come undone. The movement was sudden. His leg twisted. His foot slipped. His arms flailed wildly as he tried to steady himself. 1, 2, 3 stumbling steps, and somehow he didn't fall. Asterisk, but that only made it worse. The laughter came again. Louder this time. Crueler. It echoed from the marble, bounced from the chandeliers, filled every golden corner of the room until it was all he could hear. He could barely breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating. One of the girls gasped mockingly, hand to her mouth. Oh dear, the prince forgot how to walk. The others joined in. Ethan's eyes darted around desperately for somewhere to hide. But there was nowhere to go. The grand hall, so vast, so magnificent, had become a prison. A stage where humiliation reigned. The music played on. As if mocking him, he looked down at the gleaming floor, his reflection blurred by the shimmer of his tears. He wanted to scream, but no sound would come. His throat was tight. His fists clenched until his nails dug into his palms. Asterisk, the laughter swelled again, and he heard one of the boys say, "Maybe Daddy should buy him a new pair of legs." Something inside him cracked. Asterisk, his vision blurred. His breathing became shallow. He stood there alone, trembling, his entire small frame shaking with silent fury and shame. His body refused to move, frozen between running away and fighting back. But he did neither. He just stood, small and broken. As the storm of mockery crashed around him, he turned his head slightly, eyes darting toward the grand staircase at the far end of the hall. At the top of it stood a portrait of his father, painted years before. Jonathan Hale in a tailored black suit, eyes cold and calculating. Those same eyes now seemed to stare down at him, disappointed, condemning. A tear slipped down Ethan's cheek. He wiped it quickly, glancing around to make sure no one saw. But one boy did, Leonard. He grinned wide and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "The millionaire's son is crying." The hall erupted once more. Ethan couldn't take it anymore. His heart hammered violently in his chest. The room tilted slightly, the laughter distorting, the lights blurring together into a dizzying haze. He wanted to scream, to shout that it wasn't fair, that he hadn't asked to be born into money, into pressure, into this endless cage of expectations. But he stayed silent. The violins played their cruel melody as the laughter rang on. And there, in the center of the most prestigious ballroom in the city, surrounded by marble and gold, stood a little boy dressed like a prince, but feeling like nothing at all. His breath hitched. His vision swam. And as he fought back another tear, something inside him whispered faintly, "You are not supposed to break." But he already was. Asterisk, the laughter still hung in the air like shards of broken glass. Every echo sliced deeper into Ethan's chest. The music played on, but it no longer sounded like a melody. It was noise, chaotic and cruel. The violins that once shimmered like sunlight now screamed. The room around him seemed to spin, each face melting into another mask of mockery and malice. Ethan's body refused to move. His knees trembled, his fists shook, and the heat of humiliation crawled up his neck like fire. The laughter wasn't fading, it was growing. The more he tried to shrink away, the more the world seemed to close in. He could see the mouths of the other children, twisting into smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Could hear whispers dancing between the sneers. Pathetic. He doesn't even belong here. Daddy's money can't save him now. Every word hit like a slap. Every whisper stole another piece of his breath. His vision blurred, and for the first time that night, he truly wanted to disappear. His mind screamed for escape, but his body betrayed him, locked in place. The orchestra continued. The dancers resumed their patterns. But it was all wrong. He could feel them moving around him, circling him. As if his humiliation had become the evening's entertainment, He turned slightly toward the edge of the floor, thinking maybe, just maybe, he could walk away quietly, vanish into a corner, and pretend he was invisible. But before he could take a step, a loud snicker rang out, echoing above the music. "Where are you going, Ale?" Leonard's voice. The words stopped him cold. The laughter rippled again. His small shoulders sagged. His eyes dropped to the floor. And that's when he saw it. A hand, small, pale, steady dot. It wasn't reaching to mock him. It wasn't extended in pity. It was offered with quiet strength, open, firm, patient. Ethan froze, eyes widening. The owner of the hand stood just in front of him. Her shoes scuffed, her pink dress simple, her denim jacket hanging a little loose on her shoulders. Her golden hair was tied back in a braid, and those strands had escaped and curled at the edges. It made her look more alive, more real than anyone else in the room. Her face wasn't powdered or painted like the others. She looked like sunlight that had wandered into a storm. "Don't listen to them," she said softly. Her voice wasn't trembling. It wasn't apologetic. It carried calm certainty, like the stillness of dawn before the first light breaks. Ethan blinked, confused. He had never seen her before. She wasn't one of the girls in his dance lessons or his father's social circle. Everything about her felt out of place. The jacket, the unpolished shoes, the lack of fear in her eyes. Yet in that moment, she seemed to belong there more than anyone else. He hesitated, glancing around. The laughter had died down slightly, but whispers remained, clinging to the corners of the room like smoke. The other children watched with wide eyes. Parents exchanged puzzled looks. A few even frowned, as if the very sight of the girl standing next to Ethan were an offense. Still, she didn't move. She kept her hand out, waiting. "Come on," she said, her tone soft but sure. "Dance with me." Ethan's heart jumped. For a second, he thought she was mocking him. It had to be a trick, another cruel joke. But when he looked into her eyes, he found no malice there. Only kindness. Real, unshakable kindness. He looked again at her hand. His own was trembling. He could feel the stares drilling into him, the judgment, the disbelief. If he took it, he'd become the next round of laughter. The rich boy and the poor girl, two children the world would never allow to stand side by side. He could already hear Leonard's snide voice whispering, "He's dancing with her?" And yet, something deep inside Ethan, something fragile, but brave, stirred because for the first time that night, someone was looking at him, not his name, not his suit, not his father's wealth. Just him. He reached out slowly, hesitantly, and placed his small hand in hers. A quiet gasp rippled through the hall. Lily, though he didn't know her name, yet smiled faintly. It wasn't the polite, empty smile of a child raised among privilege. It was warm, genuine, like sunlight breaking through clouds. She gave his hand a soft squeeze. "Follow me," she whispered. The orchestra played on, the violins trembling with rhythm. She stepped forward first, her bare toes brushing the marble floor, her movements untrained but full of feeling. Ethan followed, awkward at first, trying to match her pace. Their steps were uneven, clumsy, but she didn't laugh. She only laughed with him, softly, encouragingly, as if the music belonged to them alone. Slowly, his fear began to melt. His heartbeat steadied. He focused on her hand, her rhythm, her voice. The whispers around them faded like distant echoes. He no longer saw the crowd. He no longer heard the laughter. All he saw was the girl leading him through the storm with quiet courage. And then something shifted as they moved. The air in the hall seemed to change. The laughter died completely. The violins sounded different now, sweeter, fuller. The light from the chandeliers danced over them, scattering in patterns that made the two children glow. It was no longer the dance of ridicule. It was a dance of defiance. the rich boy who stumbled, the poor girl who stood tall. Together, they turned the floor that had once been a stage of shame into something holy, something human. The crowd could only watch silent, spellbound. Even Leonard stopped smirking. Parents exchanged confused glances. Some frowned, some smiled faintly, but none could look away. The teacher stood frozen, unsure whether to interrupt or applaud Dot, and in the middle of it all, Ethan Hale, who had entered the night as a trembling boy drowning in fear, began to smile. Dot. It was small at first, just a flicker. Then it grew soft, genuine, and bright enough to reach his eyes. The violins rose, the orchestra swelled, and the two children, one clothed in silk, the other in denim, moved together as if they'd known this moment all their lives. When the music ended, silence filled the hall. A silence so deep it felt alive. Lily's braids swayed as she stepped back and gave a small curtsy, her hand still holding Ethan's. He looked at her, eyes shining. Words caught somewhere between gratitude and wonder. Dot. And then the applause began. Dot. It started hesitantly from one corner, a single pair of hands clapping. Then another, until the sound filled the grand hall like thunder. The same crowd that had mocked him now cheered for him. But Ethan wasn't listening to the applause. His world was already quiet again, because in his heart, he knew it wasn't the dance that had saved him. It was her. Asterisk, the girl with the denim jacket, who had reached into the chaos and pulled him from the storm with nothing but kindness and courage. He didn't yet know her name, but he would never forget her hand. Asterisk, the music did not stop when their hands met. It only changed. What had once been a polite, graceful waltz became something deeper, richer, alive with defiance. The violins seemed to hesitate for a breath, as though the orchestra itself had paused to witness the impossible. The millionaire's son and the cleaner's daughter standing together in the center of the grandest hall in the city. Lily's fingers were small, but her grip was steady, grounding Ethan in a world that had just moments before rejected him. His heart was still beating wildly, the remnants of fear clinging to him like a shadow. But now, it beat not with shame only, with wonder. The room around them blurred, fading into muted color and sound, as if the walls themselves held their breath. She stepped forward. He followed. Their first movements were awkward, a stumble here, a misstep there, but Lily's expression didn't waver. Her eyes held a quiet, fearless determination, the kind that spoke of a life accustomed to surviving judgment. Each time Ethan hesitated, she smiled, and somehow, that smile became a rhythm all its own, steadying his breath, his steps. His heart. Asterisk, the murmurs began again along the edges of the ballroom. Parents leaned forward. Children whispered. The orchestra musicians exchanged glances, uncertain whether to continue. And yet something about the way those two small figures stood there, framed in golden light, compelled them to play on. As the melody deepened, Lily lifted her arm, guiding Ethan into a slow turn. The boy who had been mocked and broken minutes ago now moved with a strange, fragile grace. He was still trembling, still unsure, but his fear no longer owned him. Asterisk, the audience could see it. The whispers began to fade. The laughter that had poisoned the air only minutes before fell silent, one voice at a time. What replaced it wasn't applause, nor mockery. It was stillness, a collective awe. Every movement became a story. The poor girl's courage, the rich boy's rediscovery of himself, the defiance of hierarchy in a single shared rhythm. Lily didn't dance like the other girls, whose steps had been rehearsed and taught by expensive instructors. She danced as if she were listening to something the others could not hear. Her movements were raw, imperfect, full of emotion. She wasn't performing, she was expressing. Ethan tried to follow, but it wasn't imitation. It was connection. They were learning each other's rhythm, wordlessly, step by step. A moment came when Lily twirled gently under Ethan's hand. The hem of her pink dress brushed the marble, catching the golden glow of the chandeliers. A faint smile crossed Ethan's lips, his first true smile that night, and the crowd saw it. The trembling boy who had once stood frozen in humiliation was gone. In his place stood someone transformed. Leonard, standing near the orchestra, frowned. His smirk had vanished. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing around to see if anyone else found the sight as strange as he did. But no one was laughing anymore. Even the adults, who had moments ago been entertained by a child's failure, were quiet. Jonathan Hale's son was dancing, and not with one of their own. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the rows of finely dressed parents. A woman in pearls whispered sharply to her husband, "Who is that girl?" "I don't know," he murmured back. "But look at them." The orchestra began to rise, the melody swelling as if the instruments themselves had caught the emotion of the moment. The violins soared, a cello thrummed deep and slow, and the ballroom filled with music that seemed to carry both heartbreak and hope in every note. Lily's braid swung behind her as she turned again, laughing softly, her laughter delicate but clear, like a wind chime in the silence. Ethan followed her lead now, not out of obligation or fear of judgment, but because he wanted to. Because for the first time in his life, someone had made him feel seen. They circled once more, their hands intertwined, their feet brushing the marble in rhythm with the orchestra's crescendo. Every movement drew eyes, every breath carried meaning. And then, something extraordinary happened. A chandelier light shifted, its crystal beads scattering light across the floor like 1,000 tiny stars. One beam of gold fell directly upon them, two children from opposite worlds, dancing as equals beneath heaven's spotlight. It wasn't a waltz anymore. It wasn't a performance or a lesson in etiquette. It was a declaration, an unspoken rebellion, a moment that said, "You will not break me." Ethan could feel his chest ache, not with fear, but with something fierce and bright. He didn't know the name for it yet. All he knew was that he never wanted to let go of Lily's hand, and as the orchestra reached its peak, she stepped forward and whispered something that only he could hear. "See, you can dance." It wasn't teasing. It wasn't praise. It was faith. Simple, powerful, real. Ethan blinked, his throat tight. He didn't reply. He couldn't, but his small, trembling smile said enough. When the music finally ended, the silence that followed was absolute. The last note hung in the air like a prayer before fading into eternity. No one moved. No one spoke. The spell held. Then one pair of hands began to clap, slowly, softly, then another, and another, until the entire ballroom erupted in applause that wasn't polite or rehearsed, but raw and genuine. Ethan and Lily stood hand in hand, both breathing hard. He turned to her, his blue eyes bright with emotion he couldn't name. She smiled, her cheeks flushed pink, her braids slightly undone. In that moment, the marble floors, the chandeliers, the silk gowns, all of it faded away. There were only two children, one born into gold, the other into struggle, united by something that no title, no fortune, no cruelty could erase. Lily bowed politely, as she had seen others do. Ethan followed her lead, still unsure, but no longer afraid. The applause grew louder, and somewhere near the back of the hall, a teacher wiped away a tear she didn't expect. But not everyone was clapping. At the far end of the ballroom, a man stood in the doorway, tall, composed, his sharp eyes shadowed by the glow of the chandeliers. Jonathan Hale. He had arrived just in time to see his son dancing with her. His jaw tightened, his eyes cold and unreadable, fixed on the two children in the center of the room. The applause thundered on around him, but he didn't clap. He simply watched, and as Lily smiled up at Ethan one last time before stepping away, Jonathan's hand curled slowly into a fist. The dance of defiance had ended. But the battle it awakened had only just begun. The applause still rang in Ethan's ears, long after the music had ended. He felt it not as a celebration, but as a strange, echoing dream, one he might wake from at any moment. For the first time in his short life, he had not been the punchline. He had stood in the center of the marble floor, not as Jonathan Hale's son, not as a trembling boy afraid of shadows, but as himself. And someone had stood with him. Lily. Her name floated through his mind like a whispered prayer. He didn't know it yet, but the memory of her hand in his would cling to him for years. He had never met anyone like her before. Everyone else in his life approached him as if he were an extension of his father, a name, a fortune, a future. But Lily had looked at him as though he were simply a boy who needed someone. The applause had faded. The music had stopped. The crowd dispersed, but whispers lingered behind the curtains, where the golden glow of the chandeliers dimmed into shadows. The world shifted again. Lily's mother stood near the back hall, her cleaning apron folded neatly over her arm. Her face was pale, eyes wide with worry. She had been allowed to attend the ball only as a courtesy, a token gesture of the Academy's charity toward staff. Her instructions were clear: remain invisible. Do not disturb the illusion of grandeur. Yet her daughter had stepped into the center of it all, hand in hand with the Hale boy. Under the gaze of 100 watchful eyes, she gripped her apron tighter. She knew what would follow, and she was right. A stern voice sliced through the hushed corners. Mrs. Morgan. She turned. A member of the Academy's board approached, his expression sharp, his posture stiff. His wife trailed behind him, lips pressed thin with disapproval. Sir? Lily's mother whispered, lowering her head. Your daughter? The man paused, his words coated with disdain. Your daughter disrupted the order of tonight's ball. This event was not meant for children of staff to make themselves visible. She meant no harm. Lily's mother replied quickly, her voice trembling. She only wanted to help. Help? The wife's laugh was short and cold. She embarrassed the Academy. She embarrassed the families who expect standards here. Mrs. Morgan's hands tightened around the apron. She wanted to protest, to tell them they hadn't seen what she had, the courage in Lily's eyes, the kindness in her heart. But her throat constricted. Words failed. She lowered her gaze again, as she had learned to do in countless rooms where she was not welcome. Yet she wasn't the only one listening. From the edge of the hall, Jonathan Hale had approached. He stood in silence, his figure tall, his presence so commanding that even the board member hesitated. Jonathan's eyes were fixed on Mrs. Morgan. Is that your daughter? His voice was deep, steady, but laced with something unreadable. Mrs. Morgan swallowed hard. Yes, sir. Jonathan's gaze did not leave her. He had seen her take his son's hand when no one else would. The sight had unsettled him, though he did not yet know why. There had been something familiar in her face, something that clawed at the edges of his memory. He looked down briefly, his jaw tightening. I'll speak with my son, he said at last. His tone was final, sharp as a blade. Then he turned, his coat sweeping behind him as he disappeared into the shadows. Mrs. Morgan exhaled shakily, her heart pounding. She knew what that meant. The Hale name was untouchable. And if Jonathan Hale disapproved of her daughter's actions, the Academy would not hesitate to remind her of her place. Meanwhile, Ethan had slipped away from the noise of the hall. His small feet carried him toward the quieter wings of the Academy, past velvet curtains and polished wood, until he found her Lily sitting alone on a bench near the cloakroom. She looked up when he approached. Her braid had loosened, strands of blonde hair falling around her face. She no longer looked like the girl who had defied an entire ballroom. She looked like a child who was waiting to be scolded. Ethan hesitated, then sat beside her. For a long moment, neither spoke. The muffled sounds of the ball continued in the distance, but here in the shadows, it felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of them. "Why did you help me?" Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper. Lily glanced at him. Her blue eyes were steady, though a flicker of sadness lingered there. "Because I know what it feels like." "What?" "To be laughed at. To be small. To feel like no one's on your side." She shrugged lightly, though her voice cracked just enough for him to hear the truth beneath it. "I didn't want you to feel that alone." Ethan blinked, trying to absorb her words. In his world, kindness always came with expectation. Every gift, every gesture tied to obligation or power. But this was different. She hadn't helped him to gain anything. She had helped him simply because he had needed it. He looked down at his hands, then back at hers. "Thank you," he whispered. She smiled faintly. "You don't need to thank me." But Ethan shook his head. He meant it. He had never meant anything more. For the first time, silence between two people didn't feel heavy. It felt safe. They sat there, two children from opposite worlds, bound by something neither could explain. But behind the curtain, shadows stirred. Jonathan Hale stood in a quiet corridor, his hand resting against the wall. His memories he had long buried clawed their way back. Years ago. A different life. A different woman. A promise he had abandoned. And now, her face reflected in the girl with the denim jacket. His chest tightened. Guilt pressed like iron against his ribs. The girl who had reached for his son. The girl whose courage had shamed an entire hall. He knew her blood, and in the silence of the empty corridor, Jonathan Hale whispered to himself, the words tasting of regret and revelation. "She's mine." Asterisk, the applause from the ballroom had faded into memory. But the echoes still lingered inside Jonathan Hale's mind. He sat alone in the back seat of his car, the city's streetlights flashing in rhythmic intervals across his face. Each glow illuminated a fragment of emotion. He rarely allowed himself to feel anger, confusion, guilt. The rhythmic hum of the engine did little to quiet the storm inside him. He could still see it, the way Ethan had smiled on that dance floor. His small hand clutching that girl's, Lily. The name burned in Jonathan's thoughts. Though he had heard it only once, whispered faintly by a teacher after the ball ended. Lily Morgan. A name alone was a ghost from another lifetime. Jonathan's fingers curled around the edge of the leather seat. He leaned back, eyes closing as fragments of the past began to resurface memories he had spent years burying beneath deals, titles, and the cold marble of his success. A tiny apartment. Laughter in a small kitchen. The scent of lavender soap. And a woman's voice warm, steady, filled with a kind of grace that money could never purchase. Her name had been Clara Morgan. He remembered her smile. How it had brightened even the darkest of his days when he had been just a young, ambitious man clawing his way to the top. They had loved once quietly, desperately, but love had no place in the world he was building. Not in the empire of steel and numbers he meant to conquer. So he left. He left her without a letter, without a promise. Without looking back. Until now. Because that girl, the girl who had reached for his son's trembling hand in front of the entire academy, had Clara's eyes. Blue like a clear morning sky, piercing in their innocence, and yet ancient with understanding. Jonathan exhaled, his breath trembling. "It can't be," he whispered to himself. But the denial rang hollow in the quiet car. The truth had a weight that pressed against his chest like stone. He didn't go home that night. Instead, he told his driver to take him to the academy again. The building was dark now, the ballroom empty, its chandeliers lifeless. The marble floor that had reflected his son's shame and redemption was still. Jonathan stood there alone, staring at the faint ghost of the night's events. The silence louder than applause. He thought of Ethan, the boy who had never known the warmth of affection, only the cold expectations of his father. The boy who had stood on this very floor and trembled, afraid to fail. He thought of Lily, the child who had stepped out from the shadows and reached for him, unafraid of ridicule, unafraid of the name Hale. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He could feel the faint sting of tears behind his eyes, but refused to let them fall. Men like him didn't cry. At least, not where anyone could see. He turned away from the ballroom, footsteps echoing down the empty corridor, until he reached the maintenance wing, the part of the academy few ever saw. The smell of detergent lingered faintly in the air. Light spilled from one open door. He stepped closer. Inside, Clara Morgan was folding linens into neat stacks. Her movements were slow, deliberate, each gesture marked by exhaustion. She didn't notice him at first, not until his shadow stretched across the floor. When she looked up, the years collapsed between them. Jonathan. His name left her lips as more than a word. It was a memory resurrected. He stood there, expression unreadable. His tailored coat, his polished shoes, the aura of power that surrounded him, they all seemed out of place in that modest, sterile room. I didn't come here too. He stopped himself. The words he wanted to say were too tangled. That girl, he said finally, voice low. She's yours? Clara's eyes narrowed slightly, a mix of pride and defiance flickering through them. Yes, she's my daughter. Jonathan exhaled slowly, the breath shaky. Her name? Lily? Yes. She has your mother's eyes, he said softly. But her face... His voice faltered. Clara, she looks like me. The silence between them deepened. For a long moment, only the faint hum of the fluorescent light filled the room. Clara's hands trembled as she set down the linen. She's not your responsibility, she said at last. The words were sharp, but her voice was tired. She never was. You made that choice years ago. Jonathan stepped closer, the weight of guilt pulling at every word. I made a mistake. You made a decision, she corrected, meeting his gaze. And you built your world on it. He swallowed hard. Does she know? No. A heavy silence fell again, thick with the years between them, the years she had raised Lily alone, scrubbing floors while he built empires. The years he had convinced himself that the past would stay buried. Jonathan looked down, his hands shaking slightly. She saved Ethan tonight, he murmured. No one else would help him. But she did. Clara's eyes softened. That's Lily, she said quietly. She doesn't see titles. She only sees people. Jonathan nodded, emotion tightening his throat. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain, but the words refused to form. Instead, he turned toward the doorway, pausing before leaving. She shouldn't have to grow up like this, he whispered. Not her. Clara gave a faint, bitter smile. Then maybe you shouldn't have left. He didn't reply. He couldn't. He walked away in silence, the echo of his footsteps mingling with the ache in his chest. When he reached his car again, he saw Ethan asleep in the back seat, his small head resting against the window, his expression peaceful for once. The innocence in that face was almost unbearable. Jonathan looked at him for a long time, then whispered into the darkness, "She saved you? The way I couldn't." And somewhere in the quiet heart of Rosewood Academy, beneath marble and chandeliers, a secret began to breathe again, a secret waiting to change everything. Asterisk. The final waltz, the chandeliers of Rosewood Academy gleamed once more, their golden light spilling over the marble floors like sunlight, returning to a place that had long forgotten warmth. The orchestra tuned its strings softly, the hum of anticipation echoing through the grand hall. A year had passed since that night, and night laughter had turned to silence. And silence had given birth to a miracle. The academy ball had returned. Parents stood tall in glittering gowns and tailored suits, their smiles perfectly rehearsed. The air was heavy with perfume and pride. Yet beneath the glitter, a quiet tension hung, because even among the elite, whispers still traveled like wildfire. They remembered last year's scandal, the Hale boy who couldn't dance, and the poor girl who dared to take his hand. Ethan Hale stood taller now. He was still small for his age, but there was something different about him, an invisible strength, a calm dignity. His movements no longer carried the hesitation of fear, but the quiet assurance of a boy who had discovered his own rhythm. At his side, Lily Morgan stood in a pale lavender dress, her hair braided with small silver ribbons. Her denim jacket was gone tonight, but her spirit hadn't changed. She still looked like sunlight that refused to dim. No matter how heavy the clouds above her dot, they had become inseparable in the months that followed. While the world around them whispered, they only saw each other two souls who had found home not in blood or wealth, but in understanding. At the far end of the ballroom, Jonathan Hale stood alone near the towering staircase. He wore his usual black suit, crisp and immaculate, but his face was different. There was no longer steel in his gaze, no invisible crown upon his head. He looked like a man stripped of armor, his power gone, his pride hollow. Yet for the first time in his life, he felt whole. Everything he had built was unraveling. The boardrooms that once trembled at his name now turned cold. Investors withdrew. His empire, the empire of Jonathan Hale, was collapsing quietly under the weight of his own confession. He had done it. He had told the truth, not to save himself, but to free her. To free them. He remembered that morning like a wound and a blessing. Standing before a crowd of men who had once bowed to him, he had said the words that shattered the illusion of his perfection. Her name is Lily Morgan. She is my daughter. The headlines came swiftly. The world that had once worshipped him tore his name apart in a frenzy of scandal. But he hadn't cared. For the first time in decades, he had spoken truth without fear. Now, he stood quietly among the crowd, a ghost among the living. The orchestra began its first notes, a slow, haunting waltz. The very same melody as the year before. The air seemed to shimmer with memory. Ethan hesitated at the edge of the dance floor. His eyes drifted toward the staircase. There, half in shadow, he saw his father watching. Their gazes met across the room, one filled with quiet pride, the other with forgiveness, unspoken, but deeply understood. Jonathan's breath caught. His son, no longer trembling, no longer afraid, smiled at him. Just a small smile. But it was enough. It said everything words never could. Then Lily turned to Ethan, extending her hand the same way she had a year ago, steady, warm, unafraid. The crowd hushed. The music swelled. And together, they stepped into the light. Jonathan watched as the two children began to move across the floor. The marble gleamed beneath their feet, reflecting them like the moon reflects stars. Their dance wasn't perfect. It never had been, but it was alive. It carried joy. It carried memory. It carried the defiance that had rewritten an entire night of cruelty into something sacred. The audience looked on silently, spellbound again, just as they had been 1 year before. Only now, the laughter was gone. In its place was awe. Ethan spun Lily gently. Her ribbons shimmered under the chandeliers. The orchestra rose higher. Around them, the world seemed to fade, parents, whispers, chandeliers, all dissolving into light. Only their laughter remained, soft and pure, echoing like bells in Jonathan's heart. He felt tears rising, but did not wipe them away. They rolled down his cheeks slowly, quietly, like penance. He had spent a lifetime chasing power, respect, control, and yet, the most powerful thing he had ever done was lose it all for love. As he stood there, a memory surfaced the first time he had ever held Ethan as a baby. The warmth of tiny fingers curling around his own. And another Clara's voice, soft and sure, whispering, "One day the world will take everything from you, Jonathan. When it does, I hope you'll remember what matters." He remembered now. On the dance floor, Lily laughed as Ethan tripped slightly but caught himself. The sound was music within the music, pure, human, real. Jonathan smiled through his tears. That's what matters, he thought. Not marble, not money, not control. Only this. Only them. The orchestra reached its crescendo. Ethan twirled Lily once more, and for a brief shining moment, the chandeliers above seemed to burst with light, scattering 1,000 reflections across the marble, like stars falling from heaven. It was the same song, the same floor. But this time, there was no shame. Only grace. When the final note faded, the room erupted in applause. Not polite, not forced. True applause, the kind that rises from hearts, not hands. Ethan and Lily bowed together, fingers still intertwined. Jonathan stepped back into the shadowed corridor, unseen, unacknowledged. He didn't need their recognition. He didn't need redemption in their eyes. He had already found it in his son's smile, in his daughter's courage, in the waltz that had rewritten their story. He turned toward the grand doors and began to walk away, each step slow, deliberate, echoing across the marble one last time. Behind him, the applause continued. He didn't look back. Outside, the night air was cool and still. The moon hung low over the academy, bathing the courtyard in silver light. Jonathan paused, tilting his head toward the ballroom windows. Through the glass, he could see them, two small silhouettes, dancing beneath golden chandeliers. Ethan and Lily, brother and sister. Light and legacy. The two halves of the redemption he had never thought he deserved. Jonathan smiled softly, a broken, peaceful smile. He took a deep breath of the night air. It smelled like rain and renewal. He had lost everything that once defined him. And yet, standing there beneath the stars, watching his children dance, Jonathan Hale felt for the first and last time in his life truly free. The orchestra began the song again inside the ballroom, faint and distant, carrying on the wind like a lullaby. And as the night wrapped itself around the academy, the man who had conquered the world closed his eyes and whispered to the dark, "Dance well, my children. Dance better than I ever did." The music swelled, and the night held its breath. The final waltz had begun.